The Alpha King pointed at the trembling girl in the corner and said, "I choose her." Mara did not want to be there. She had made that clear to her aunt 3 times on the drive over, and her aunt had ignored her 3 times, eyes fixed on the road ahead, fingers tight on the steering wheel. The estate gates opened before they even slowed down, as if the house had been watching for them, and that alone made Mara's stomach drop. She was 22 years old and had spent most of her life being overlooked. That was not something she said with bitterness. It was simply the truth. After her parents died in a road accident when she was 9, she had gone to live with her mother's younger sister, Kara, a quiet woman who worked as a domestic coordinator for the Vaskov household. Kara was not a cruel woman. She fed Mara, clothed her, kept her in school. But love was not something Kara gave easily, and so Mara had grown up understanding that she was there on borrowed space and borrowed time, and the best thing she could do was stay small. She had become very good at staying small. Kara had explained the evening simply. Once a year, Alexander Vaskov, the head of the Vaskov family, hosted what his circle called a formal introduction dinner. In plain language, it was a selection event. The powerful families of the region brought their daughters, and Alexander, who had not yet taken a wife despite being 34 years old and the single most influential man in the private business world of the Northern Territories, would observe. Sometimes nothing came of it. Sometimes he made a choice. The families who attended did so because declining was not an option they were willing to live with. Kara had been invited to attend as part of the household staff. Mara had been listed on the guest record simply because Kara had mentioned her when filling out the attendance form, more out of habit than intention. She was not expected to be noticed. She was not a daughter of any family. She had no fortune, no connections, no last name that opened doors. She was, for all practical purposes, furniture. She wore a pale grey dress that Kara had borrowed from a neighbor. It was a little long in the hem and a little loose at the shoulders, and Mara had pinned the left strap twice to stop it from slipping. Her hair was pulled back. She wore no jewelry. She had no makeup beyond a thin coat of clear lip balm. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who did not belong in a room like this. The hall was enormous. Crystal chandeliers dropped from ceilings that were at least 15 feet high. The walls were paneled in dark wood, hung with paintings that looked old and expensive. Round tables with white linen filled the center of the room, each set with more silverware than Mara had owned in her entire life. Women in silk and structured gowns moved through the space with the ease of people who had grown up knowing how to carry themselves in rooms like this. Their laughter was measured. Their posture was deliberate. Even the way they reached for their glasses looked rehearsed. Mara stood near the far wall beside a large potted plant and held a glass of water she had not taken a sip from. She was watching the door when he walked in. She had heard the name Alexander Vaskov her whole life, mostly in the careful, lower tones that adults use when speaking about someone they are afraid of. She had built an image in her mind over the years, older, heavy, the kind of man whose power showed in excess. She had been wrong. He was tall, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than luck. Dark hair, short and neat. He wore a black suit with no tie, the collar of his shirt open by one button, and somehow that single detail made him look more in control than every other man in the room who was overdressed. His face was sharp, unreadable, and he moved through the hall the way someone moves through a space they own, which was, of course, because he did. The room shifted when he entered. Conversations shortened. Postures straightened. Even the music seemed to quiet a degree. He shook hands with 3 men near the entrance, spoke briefly, and then he began to walk. He moved slowly along the edge of the room, and it was clear he was observing. Not in an obvious way. He did not stare. He was simply present in a way that meant nothing in the room escaped him. The women who had prepared for this moment, who had arrived with practiced smiles and positioned themselves in sight lines carefully calculated over weeks, watched him with controlled hope. Mara turned back to look at the potted plant beside her and thought about the book she had left open on her bed at home. She did not see him change direction. She did not notice the hall growing quieter until the silence had already settled like a weight over the room. She looked up because the woman 2 feet to her left had stopped breathing. Alexander Vaskov was standing 12 feet away, and he was looking directly at her. Not past her. Not in her general direction. At her, with the kind of focused attention that feels like a hand pressed to your chest. Mara's heart kicked so hard she felt it in her throat. She looked behind her, instinctively, even though she was already against the wall and there was nowhere further back to go. There was no one behind her. She looked back at him. He raised one hand, just slightly, and pointed at her. Not a dramatic gesture. Not a performance. Just a single, calm, certain motion that cut through every silk dress and rehearsed smile in the room like a blade through still water. "I choose her," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room was so completely silent that every person in it heard him clearly, and every person in it turned to look at the girl in the borrowed grey dress who was standing near the potted plant with a glass of water she had never touched. Mara felt her legs go uncertain beneath her. She pressed her back harder against the wall without realizing she had done it. Her face had gone pale, and her fingers tightened around the glass until her knuckles ached. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood there and thought, with perfect clarity, that there had been a mistake. Except there had not been a mistake, and somewhere in the part of her brain that had always been very good at reading a room, she knew it. He had not looked at anyone else before he looked at her. He had not hesitated. He had not looked again to confirm. He had walked toward her corner of the room with the same certainty a man uses when he is going somewhere he has already decided to go. Kara appeared at Mara's side within seconds, her face a complicated arrangement of shock and something that might have been guilt. One of Alexander's advisors, a precise man in a grey suit, crossed the floor toward them with a small nod of acknowledgement and a folded card in his hand. He held it out to Kara, who took it with trembling fingers. Around them, the room exhaled. Some women looked away. Some whispered. One, near the center table, set her champagne glass down with a small sharp sound that said everything she was not going to say out loud. Alexander had already turned back toward the main table and was speaking with his senior staff as if he had done nothing more unusual than order a second course. Mara's and pressed the card into her hand. On it was a single address and a date. 2 days from now? What does this mean? Mara asked, though she already knew. Carol looked at her with eyes that held an apology she did not know how to speak out loud. "It means," she said quietly, "that your life is about to change." Mara looked down at the card. Then she looked across the room to where Alexander Vaskov stood with his back to her, completely composed, completely certain, as if the most significant thing he had done all evening was also the simplest. She had been invisible her entire life. She did not know yet whether being seen by a man like this was better. What she did know was that she was frightened in a way she had not been since she was 9 years old, standing in the rain outside a hospital while a doctor explained to her aunt that her parents were not coming out. The difference was that this time, whatever was coming was not an accident. Someone had chosen it. And she had no idea why. 2 days felt like no time at all and somehow also like a sentence. Mara sat on the edge of her bed the morning after the dinner with the card still in her hand and tried to think clearly, which was difficult because her heart had not fully slowed since the moment his eyes had found hers across that room. She had replayed it 100 times already. The walk. The silence. The point of his hand. The words, simple and final, falling into the quiet room like a stone into still water. She told herself it was a mistake. Then she told herself it was a test of some kind. Then she told herself perhaps it was cruelty dressed up as choice, a power movement to embarrass the girls who had come prepared, by selecting the one who had come with nothing. She considered every explanation that did not require her to believe that a man like Alexander Vaskov had looked at a room full of eligible, accomplished, beautiful women and genuinely wanted her. None of her explanations held together. Kara knocked and came in before Mara could answer, which was also a habit she had never thought to address. She sat at the edge of the small chair near the window and folded her hands in her lap. Outside, a bus went past. Somewhere below, a neighbor's radio played something bright and cheerful that felt like an insult to the heaviness in the room. "You need to pack," Kara said. "I don't understand what I'm packing for." Caelan exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that carries years in it. He chose you. What happens next is that his staff will arrange everything. You'll move to the estate. You'll be provided for. You'll be treated well. Treated well, Mara repeated. You'll want for nothing. That's not actually an answer. Caelan looked at the window. Mara, I know this isn't what you planned. I didn't plan anything because no one asked me. That's how it works with families like his. Mara stared at her aunt and felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter than anger and harder to name. You put my name on that list. It was a formality. I didn't think. You didn't think he would choose me. Caelan said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Mara looked down at the card in her hand. The address was printed in clean black ink. No explanation. No question. Just the assumption that a destination was all she needed, because the decision had already been made. She packed one bag. She told herself it was because she was coming back. The car that arrived for her was black and quiet and driven by a man who did not speak the entire journey. Mara sat in the back and watched the city change outside the window, the streets growing wider, the buildings older and larger, the landscaping more deliberate, until they turned through a set of iron gates and the estate appeared at the end of a long gravel drive like something from a story she had not agreed to be in. Inside, she was met by a woman named Claire, the household manager, who was brisk and organized and spoke in the careful tone of someone who had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. Claire showed her to a room on the second floor that was larger than the entire apartment Mara had grown up in. The bed was made with white linen. There were flowers on the side table. The window looked out over a formal garden that stretched further than she could easily see. Is there anything you need? Claire asked, from the doorway. To understand what's happening, Mara said. Claire's expression did not change. Mr. Vaskov will speak with you this evening. And until then, you're free to move through the main areas of the house. The library is on the ground floor, east wing. There is a sitting room with television. Lunch will be at 1. Then she was gone. Mara stood in the middle of the room and breathed. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. She had learned from a young age that falling apart was a luxury that required someone to put you back together, and she had never been confident enough in anyone's presence to afford it. So she did what she always did. She looked at the situation clearly, identified the edges of it, and tried to find which parts she could actually control. She could not control the fact that she was here. She could not control whatever Alexander Vaskov intended. She could not control the timeline or the stakes or the world this house represented. What she could control was herself. She changed into her own clothes, took her one bag, and spent the next 4 hours exploring the house quietly, touching nothing she did not need to touch, observing everything. The estate was enormous but not cold. There were signs of real life in it, one spot on the carpet near the library door, a coffee ring on the corner of a reading table that someone had tried to clean but not quite erased, bookshelves that had clearly been read from rather than arranged for appearance. She filed each small thing away. She was building a picture of the man she had not yet spoken to, the way she had always built pictures of people before they could disappoint her with the real version. He found her, as it turned out, before evening. She was in the library, standing at the far shelf with a book open in her hands. She was reading about migratory patterns in Arctic birds, which she did not normally care about, but it was the first book she had opened and she had made herself read it because it gave her hands something to do. She heard no footsteps. She simply became aware that the air in the room had changed, and she turned. Alexander Vaskov stood in the doorway of his own library with his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, holding a folder of papers he had clearly been carrying from somewhere else, and he was watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not cold. Not warm. Evaluating. You read, he said. It was such a plain statement that Mara blinked. Most people do. Most people here don't. They perform reading. You were actually reading. She held up the book. It's about birds. Something moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of amusement. You picked that one first. It was at eye level. He stepped into the room and set the folder on the table near the door without looking at it. He had the kind of self-possession that Mara associated with people who had learned to waste nothing, no movement, no word, no second. He crossed to the chair near the window and sat, not as if inviting a conversation but as if beginning one he had already decided to have. "Sit down," he said. Then, a moment later, more quietly, "Please." Mara closed the book, put it back on the shelf, and sat in the chair across from him. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the garden light was beginning to shift toward evening gold. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "Only one," Mara replied. "Why?" He did not look away. "Because you were the only person in that room who was not pretending." Mara held his gaze and waited for more, because that was not an answer. It was the beginning of one. Every woman there had prepared something, he continued. A version of themselves designed for that evening. Practice smiles. Calculated positioning. Everything arranged for maximum visibility. He paused. "You were standing next to a plant hoping no one would notice you. That's not a reason to choose someone." "No," he agreed. But it was a reason to look more carefully. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. Mara had expected coldness, the kind of controlled distance that men with power often used as armor. What she found instead was something more difficult, a person who spoke in exact sentences and seemed to mean each one. "What happens now?" she asked. "You stay. And if I don't want to?" He held her eye steadily. "Do you want to leave?" She considered lying. She was, when necessary, an excellent liar. But something about the directness of his question made a lie feel like the wrong tool. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded, as if that was the right answer. "Then stay until you do." It was not a command. That was the thing she turned over in her mind later that night, lying in the white linen bed in the too-large room, staring at the ceiling while the estate settled into quiet around her. He had said it like an offer. The next morning, Claire delivered breakfast to her room along with a note, not a printed card this time, but a handwritten line on plain paper in a script that was neat but quick. It read, "The East Garden is worth seeing before the light shifts." Mara held the note for a moment. Then she got up, dressed, and went to the East Garden. What she found there made her stand still at the entrance for a full minute, a wild section within the otherwise formal grounds, where flowers had been allowed to grow according to their own preference, climbing over low stone walls, spreading in colors that had nothing to do with design. It was the only part of the estate that looked entirely uncontrolled. It was also the most beautiful part. She did not see him there that morning. But she understood, in the way that she had always understood things quietly before she could explain them, that he had known she would think so. She did not know yet what that meant. But she stayed for 2 hours, and she did not think once about the book on her bed at home. The first time Mara saw past the wall Alexander Vaskov kept around himself was an accident, and she suspected he knew it and was not pleased about it. It was 10 days into her time at the estate. The arrangement had settled into something that could almost be called routine. Breakfast appeared at 8. Claire managed the household with quiet efficiency. Mara had been given full access to the library, the East Garden, a small sitting room near the back of the house that caught afternoon light, and the main dining room at mealtimes. She was not locked in. She was not followed. She was simply, very deliberately, included in the rhythm of the house without being included in the life of its owner. She saw Alexander at dinner most evenings. He sat at the head of the long table. She sat at his right. They talked. The conversations were odd in their precision. He asked her questions that no one had ever asked her, not where she had gone to school or what she had studied, but what she thought about things. She found herself answering honestly, more honestly than she had ever answered anyone, partly because she was not performing anything for him and partly because he listened in a way that made performance feel pointless. She learned small things. He drank his coffee black and too hot. He read 3 newspapers in the morning and argued internally with all of them. He had a scar on the inside of his left forearm that he never explained and she never asked about. When he was thinking hard, he went very still, the kind of still that meant everything inside was moving fast. She did not learn why she was there, not in any way that satisfied her. He said she would understand in time, which was not a satisfying answer, and she told him so, and he almost smiled. The accident happened on a Thursday. She had come down earlier than usual because she could not sleep, and she had gone to the kitchen for water, and on the way back she had heard a voice through the door of his private study. Not loud. Not angry. But tight, the way a voice gets when a person is holding something down by sheer force. She stopped walking because she recognized the tone. She had heard it before, years ago, from Kara, on the phone with a hospital about a bill they could not pay. It was the tone of someone being asked to give something they did not have more of. She should have kept walking. She knew it even then. She stood outside the door for 30 seconds, long enough to hear him say, in that carefully controlled voice, "I cannot lose anyone else. Do you understand me?" Not one more person. Then silence. Then the sound of the call ending. She had already stepped back 2 paces by the time the door opened, but she was still close enough that he saw her immediately. He stopped. His face went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, tighter, more defended. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I wasn't listening," she said, which was partially true. "I came down for water." He looked at her. Then he looked at the glass in her hand. Then he stood aside from the doorway. "Come in." She almost said no. But something in the exhaustion on his face, which he was working very hard to keep off his face and not entirely succeeding, made her walk through the door. The study was the most personal room she had seen in the house. Bookshelves on every wall, but these were marked and broken-spined, actually used. A desk stacked with real work, contracts, maps, printed reports with handwritten notes in the margins. And on the corner of the desk, a photograph in a plain frame, the only personal image she had seen anywhere in the estate. She did not look at it directly. She sat in the chair he indicated and waited. He sat at the desk and was quiet for a moment, which she had come to understand was how he prepared his words. "There is a man," he said finally, "named Draveth. He and my family have had a conflict going back many years. The details are complicated. What matters is that he has recently identified something he believes gives him leverage over me." Mara felt the stillness in her own chest. "He is tracking a bloodline," Alexander continued. "A specific family line connected to someone who crossed him a very long time ago. He believes that finding the last person from that line gives him something he can use. Against you," she said. "Against everyone in my circle. It's not about me personally. It's about sending a message." She looked at him. "And the last person from this bloodline is you," he said. The room did not change. The light did not shift. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago, and somehow also completely different. Mara sat with it. She was good at sitting with hard things without moving. Years of practice. "So you chose me at that dinner," she said slowly, "because of this." "I chose you," he said carefully, "because if Draveth found you before I did, you would have had no protection, no warning, and no choice in anything that followed. Bringing you here meant he could not reach you. It meant you were under my protection whether you knew you needed it or not. You could have told me. You would not have believed me. You don't know that." "You wouldn't have," he said, and the certainty in it was not arrogance. It was simply accurate, and they both knew it. If a stranger had knocked on her door 2 weeks ago and told her she was in danger from a man she had never heard of because of a bloodline she had never known about, she would have closed the door. She pressed her palms flat against her knees. "So I'm here because I'm a target. You're here because I wasn't willing to leave a target unprotected. That's a very kind way to say I'm bait." He was quiet for a bit. "You are not bait. You are the opposite of bait. Bait is left exposed to draw something in. You are here precisely so that you cannot be found, reached, or used. She looked at him for a long moment. There was no softness in his expression, but there was something else, something that looked very much like genuine concern pressed behind a professional frame. Is my aunt safe? She asked. Yes. I've made arrangements. Without telling me. Without telling you, he confirmed. Because at the time, you didn't trust me enough for an explanation to matter. And now? He looked at her steadily. I'm trying. Mara sat with that too. She turned to look at the window, where the garden was barely visible in the dark, just shapes and shadows of the wild section she had come to love more than she expected. The photograph, she said quietly, not looking at him. He did not answer immediately. On your desk, she said. The only one in the house. Another pause. Then, my brother. She turned back. His expression had not changed, but the held quality of his voice told her what he was not saying. He's gone, she said. It was not a question. 3 years ago. Because of this same conflict. Because I didn't move fast enough. She understood then. Not everything, but enough. The line she had heard through the door. I cannot lose anyone else. She thought about saying she was sorry. She decided against it, because he did not look like a man who found comfort in the word. Tell me everything, she said instead. From the beginning. If I'm in this, I need to understand all of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he began. They talked through the night. He told her about his family's history, the alliances, the falling out with Draveth, the years of low-level conflict that had sharpened into something more dangerous in the last 18 months. He told her about her own family, things she had not known, a connection between her father and a man in Alexander's world that had made her bloodline significant in a way no one had ever explained to her. She listened. She asked questions. She pushed back on the parts that didn't make sense and he revised or clarified without defensiveness, which surprised her. When the first grey light came through the study window, they had been talking for over 5 hours. You should sleep, he said. So should you? He looked at the desk, the stack of work. Later. She stood and moved to the door. Then she stopped and turned back because something in her would not let her leave without saying it. I'm still not sure how I feel about being here, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend it's simple. I know, he said. But I'm not running. He held her gaze. And for the first time since she had arrived at this house, something in his expression opened slightly, just at the edges, like a door pushed 1 inch from its frame. Good, he said. She went upstairs. She lay on the white linen bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about everything she had just learned, the danger she was standing in the middle of, the man she was beginning to understand was standing in front of it. She did not know yet what any of it would cost. But she slept, finally, and dreamlessly, in a way she had not slept since she was a child who had not yet learned to be afraid. 3 weeks passed after the night in the study, and something shifted between them quietly, the way weather changes, not all at once but in the gradual accumulation of small things until you look up one morning and realize the season is different. They still had dinner together each evening. But the formality of it had loosened. She brought books to the table sometimes. He brought work. They ate and talked and occasionally sat in silence that did not need to be filled, which was a kind of intimacy that Mara had never really had with anyone and was not entirely sure how to navigate. He told her things he had told no one. She understood this not because he said so, but because of the way he said them, carefully, as if each one was being placed somewhere new rather than repeated. She told him things too. About her parents, who she mostly remembered in fragments now, her father's laugh, her mother's hands, the way the car had smelled of oranges on the day they died. About Carol, who had done her best but had never known how to give warmth to a child who needed it. About the years of making herself smaller and quieter until she was not sure how much of her was real and how much was just the habit of disappearing. Alexander listened the way he did everything, completely, without performance. She did not know she was falling into something until it was already too late to pretend she was not. The danger, meanwhile, had not gone away. His security staff moved with slightly more urgency. There were brief conversations she was not part of but could read the edges of in the faces of the people she passed in the corridors. Draveth was getting closer to something. She understood that, though the specifics were kept from her in a way she found both protective and suffocating. It was a Tuesday morning when everything broke open. She was in the East Garden when Claire found her. Claire, who was always composed, had a brightness in her eyes that was not calm. "We need to move," Claire said. "Now. Please come with me." "What's happening?" "Mr. Vaskov will explain." "Please." Mara followed. Inside, the house was moving. Staff she rarely saw were visible in corridors with equipment she did not recognize. 2 large vehicles were pulling around to the back entrance. Alexander was in the main hallway speaking to 3 men in low, rapid sentences that stopped when he saw her. He crossed to her immediately. He took her arm, not roughly, just with direction, and walked her toward the rear of the house. "We've had a security breach," he said quietly. "Someone inside the household passed information. We don't know everything yet. We are moving to a secondary location until I do." "How long?" "I don't know." "Alexander." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. "Am I actually safe?" He looked at her directly. "Yes." "You're sure?" "As long as you're with me," he said, and the simplicity of it, not as a romantic statement but as a plain fact about proximity and protection, made her chest tighten. She nodded. They kept moving. The safe house was 3 hours away, a low stone building in a rural area that looked unremarkable from the outside and was, she discovered, anything but unremarkable inside. It was equipped and stocked and prepared in a way that suggested it had been ready for a long time. There were 2 other staff members there, a security specialist named Owen and a woman named Dale who handled logistics. There was no household team. No Claire. No formal dining room. There was a kitchen, a living space, 3 bedrooms, and a great deal of silence. For the first 2 days, Alexander was almost entirely occupied with calls and briefings. Mara stayed out of his way, read, walked the perimeter of the small property, and tried not to feel the particular weight of being somewhere remote and closed in with no clear timeline. On the 3rd evening, he came into the kitchen where she was making tea because she needed something to do with her hands, and he sat at the small table and did not speak for a moment. "It was someone who had been with the household for 11 years, he said finally. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the table. "Owen confirmed it this afternoon. A senior member of my domestic staff. Draveth found something to use against him." He paused. His daughter was in difficulty. Financial. Draveth offered a way out in exchange for information. Mara was quiet for a moment. "Is his daughter safe now?" Alexander looked up at her. Something moved across his face that she could not quite name. "I made sure of it," he said. Whatever he did to his family's situation, she didn't choose it. She sat down across from him with her tea. That was kind. It was practical. She was not a threat. You could call it both. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, more quietly, "I am not always kind. I know. I've made decisions in my life that hurt people. Some of them necessary. Some of them less so." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I want you to know that. Not because I need you to forgive anything. But because you see things clearly, and I would rather you see me clearly than see a version I've curated." Mara held his gaze. "Why does it matter to you what I see?" He did not answer immediately. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and the safe house creaked, the small creak of an old building settling. "Because I have spent a very long time being known only as what I control," he said. "The estate. The business. The conflict with Draveth. The power. No one has asked what I'm like when none of those things are in the room." He looked at her steadily. "You do. What are you like?" she asked. He thought about it. She liked that he actually thought about it instead of reaching for a practiced answer. Tired, he said finally. I think underneath most of it, I am very tired. She did not say she understood, because understanding needed no announcement between them by now. They sat in the kitchen of the safe house for a long time after the tea was finished, not talking about Draveth or bloodlines or security breaches. She asked him about his brother, not the death but the before, and he told her, and she told him about a summer when she was 11 and Kara had taken her to the sea for 1 week, the only real holiday she could remember, and how the feeling of that week had stayed with her, clean and separate from everything else. He listened the way he always listened. Completely. She did not know, lying awake in her room later that night, exactly when the thing growing between them had stopped being complicated and started being simple. Not easy, not unchallenged, but simple in the way that true things are simple. Beneath all the noise and danger and unanswered questions, it was just two people who had both spent their lives not being fully known, learning what it felt like to stop hiding. She also did not know that 2 days later, a message would arrive that would blow it completely apart. It came through Owen to Alexander at 7 in the morning, and she knew immediately from the change in the house that it was serious. Owen's voice through the wall was too controlled. Alexander went quiet in the kind of way that meant he was pulling every resource inward. She waited. He found her in the sitting room an hour later. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, and in that moment she read every word before he said it. Draveth has sent information, he said. Through a third party. He wanted to make sure you received it. She kept her hand still in her lap. What information? He crossed to her and sat, not across from her this time but beside her, which itself told her something. He held a printed page, face down on his knee. Mora. He said her name with a weight she had not heard from him before. What I'm about to tell you should have come from me, earlier, and I made a decision to delay it because I believed the timing was wrong and I was protecting you, and I understand now that I was also protecting myself. She felt the cold settle in her chest. Your parents' accident, he said. 13 years ago. She went completely still. My family knew about the conflict with Draveth's organization at that time. There were people in our circle who were aware of the danger and of which individuals were at risk. He held her eyes with an effort that was visible. Your father was one of them. He was flagged as someone Draveth might target. Someone in my family's network was meant to warn him. To get him and your mother out of the area. She could hear her own heartbeat. They didn't, she said. They didn't, he confirmed. There was a failure? Whether it was negligence or something else, I cannot tell you with certainty. What I can tell you is that my family knew there was a risk to your parents and the warning did not reach them in time. Maura looked at the wall across from her. The accident. The rain. The hospital. Carol's face. She was 9 years old and there was a doctor and the lights in the corridor were too bright and Carol had gripped her hand too hard and that was the moment her whole life had split into before and after. How long have you known this? She asked. Her voice came out very flat. I found the full account 8 months ago, in my family's private records. I had been working through them after my brother's death. He paused. I recognized your family name immediately. 8 months. And you chose me at that dinner knowing this? Yes. She stood up. She did not shout. She was not that kind of person. She crossed to the window and stood with her back to him and let the silence do what it needed to do. He did not feel it. You let me live in your house, she said. You sat with me. You told me to trust you. And the whole time you were carrying this. Yes. Why? She turned around. If you found out 8 months ago, why not come to me then? Or tell me when I arrived? Or any night in that dining room when you were asking me what I thought about things? His jaw was tight. Because I wanted to be someone worth telling it to before I told it. The honesty of that hit her somewhere unguarded and she had to look away again. That doesn't make it right, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the trees moved in the morning wind and the world looked ordinary and indifferent. "I need to not be in this room," she said. He stood. "Maura. I'm not leaving the building." Her voice was steady. "I understand the situation. I'm not going to do something that puts me at risk because I'm angry." She moved toward the door. "But I need to be somewhere that isn't here right now." She went to her room and closed the door quietly, because loud would have cost her something she was not willing to spend. She sat on the floor, not the bed. The floor felt more honest. She stayed there for a very long time and held the weight of 13 years of a question she had not known she was asking, and the answer she had just been given, and the man who had given it, and all the ways she did not know yet what to do with any of it. 3 months. That was how long Maura had been back in her own life, a small apartment in a mid-sized city 4 hours from the estate, working a daytime position at an independent bookshop that smelled of old paper and dust and nothing complicated. She had found it within 2 weeks of leaving the safe house. She had furnished the apartment minimally and paid the deposit in cash from savings she had built quietly over years. She had not gone back. She had not called. She had walked out of that safe house with her one bag, the same bag she had packed when this had all begun, and she had taken a car to the nearest town and then a train and then another train and then she had simply stopped moving when the city felt right. Owen had reached out once, professionally, to confirm that her security situation had been resolved. He was brief and neutral about it. She thanked him and hung up. She thought about Alexander every day. She wanted to be honest about that, at least with herself. She thought about him in the way you think about a fracture in a bone after it has healed, not with constant pain but with a persistent awareness. The awareness of something that had been close to breaking and then had been held together by will, and might be permanently changed by the experience, but was still there. She thought about what he had said. "I wanted to be someone worth telling it to before I told it." She had turned that sentence over so many times in the past 3 months that the edges of it had gone smooth. It was not a justification. She had never accepted it as one. But she had come, slowly and reluctantly, to understand it. She had sat with the version of him she had come to know, the man who was tired and careful and more honest than most, and she had tried to weigh that against the silence he had kept, and she had not yet found the bottom of the scale. She did not hate him. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had tried, because hatred would have been simpler. Hatred would have made the decision for her. But what she found when she turned inward was not hatred, not even close. What she found was grief. Grief for her parents, reopened and rawer than it had been in years. And underneath the grief, something that confused her more, something that looked almost like grief for him. For the version of him that had been sitting with this for 8 months, carrying it, not because he was cowardly but because he was, in his own specific and complicated way, trying. She hated that she understood it. She hated that understanding did not cancel the wound. The bookshop owner, a quiet man named Arthur in his 60s who asked nothing personal and appreciated efficient shelving, had given her Saturday afternoons off. She usually walked. The city had a canal that ran along the north edge of the shopping district and she had fallen into the habit of walking its length and then sitting on a bench near the lock where the water changed level, watching the small mechanical miracle of it happen, water raising and lowering in an ordered way, which felt like something she needed to see. She was on that bench on a Saturday in late autumn, with the coffee she had let go cold, when she became aware that someone had stopped walking on the path behind her. She did not turn immediately. She let herself breathe. Then she turned. Alexander Vaskov stood on the canal path in a coat she had not seen before, holding nothing, with no car visible and no security detail, looking like a man who had walked a long way and was not sure what to do with having arrived. He looked thinner. Not unhealthy, but like someone who had been working very hard and sleeping less than necessary. His expression, when it met hers, was not the controlled blankness he had shown the world on the night of the dinner. It was something open and uncertain, and on his face those two things looked almost painful. She turned back to the canal. She heard him step off the path and onto the grass. She did not move or speak. He came around and sat on the far end of the bench. Not close. He left the full length of it between them. He looked at the canal. They sat like that for almost 2 minutes without speaking, and the canal lock ran through one complete cycle. I found your city by accident, he said finally. I wasn't looking. She glanced at him sideways. I don't believe that. A pause. I was looking, he admitted. I just didn't plan what I would do when I got here. So you walked around until you found me? I walked around for 4 days, he said. I wasn't sure I would tell you I was here at all. She looked at the water. A dog crossed the far edge of the lock, unbothered. Drevko, she said. Handled. Completely and permanently. He will not be a threat to anyone in our world again. His voice was neutral on this, and she did not ask for details because she understood enough to know she did not need them. And the household. The person who passed information. His daughter is in a stable situation. He was let go. There was no further action against him. He paused. It was not his fault, what he did. It was fear for someone he loved. I understand that. She turned to look at him properly for the first time. He was looking at the canal with the particular stillness he had when something mattered and he was not going to perform that it did. Why are you here? She asked. He turned to meet her eyes. Because I spent 3 months sitting with everything I got wrong. And I came to tell you that. Not to ask me to come back. No, he said. I came to tell you what I should have told you months before I did, and to say it without asking anything in return. He breathed once. Your parents deserve the warning that never came. I cannot give it to them. I cannot change what happened or the years you spent not knowing why. What I can do is tell you that it has been the thing I have most needed to say to you since before I knew you, and I should have said it the moment you arrived. Not when I thought the time was right. The time is never right for something like that. I just needed to say it. Maura looked at him for a long time. The canal moved. A gust of wind pushed through the row of trees along the bank and shook the last of the autumn leaves free. I know you're not asking me to forgive you, she said. I'm not. But I need you to know that I don't, she said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That's not me punishing you. It's just honest. I know, he said. I'm not here for forgiveness. Then what are you here for? He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, simply, without the armor she had watched him wear so consistently for so long, I'm here because you were the only real choice I've ever made in my life, and I don't know how to stop thinking about it. The bench was old and the wood was cold and the coffee she'd let go cold was still in her hand and the canal moved in its ordered way and none of it was a romantic scene. It was just a bench on a Tuesday afternoon in a city no one particularly thought of as significant, and a man who had come 4 days early and walked around not knowing whether to say hello. She looked at him. He looked at her. She reached out and set the cold coffee down on the arm of the bench and then she reached across the space between them and she took his hand. Not because everything was resolved. Not because the grief was gone or the wound was closed or because she had calculated a happy ending out of the wreckage of the last several months. But because when she held the question of him in the truest part of herself, the answer was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. His hand tightened around hers, just once, and he exhaled in a way she had never heard from him before, like something very long held was leaving his body. They sat on the bench until the cold drove them off it, and then they walked along the canal path as the afternoon went grey, and she told him about the bookshop and Arthur and the dog that crossed the lock every Saturday, and he listened the way he always had, with every part of himself. Nothing was promised. Nothing was declared. No one said the word future. But they walked in the same direction, side by side, and neither of them pulled away, and in the city that she had chosen because it had felt like the right place to stop moving, she thought that maybe the right place was less about location than she had assumed. Maybe it was about who you were standing next to when you finally stopped running from the things that had hurt you. She had spent her whole life making herself invisible. And somewhere between a borrowed dress and a potted plant and a man who had pointed at her across a crowded room with complete and quiet certainty, she had learned, without meaning to, that being seen was not the same as being in danger. Sometimes it was the opposite. Sometimes it was the only way back to yourself.